All right, so we've been going through all these, and we're going to continue to do this, go through them. The first one, obviously, the BNSF, and we've gone through the Santa Fe, the Burlington, the Great Northern. Now we're going to do the Northern Pacific, but they didn't get any money, and so the official start date was May 1866, and then later they had to extend it because that was right after the war, and there were problems financing and stuff like that. Um, so the land grant was modified by Congress. There's the capital in 1870, and they granted additional land, and they did allow the sale of mortgage bonds because it wasn't going to happen. So meanwhile, the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad built from St. Paul to Lake Superior and Duluth. So we can take a look at. They built this thing, which became the Scally line. If you remember, they used to run Milwaukee ran the Scally because the Milwaukee got trackage rights on this thing when they built it. Right. For 999 years. If you can imagine, these guys, they were thinking big. So the Milwaukee has trackage rights, which now the CP actually uses on the Great Northern Line. But yeah, this line was built, and it was very important because that's the NP said, well, we don't need to go downtown Duluth because it's kind of difficult to build into the city. So we'll just start at the Thompson's Junction, which is west of Duluth on the Minneapolis, Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad. So you go out of town, I don't know, 20 miles or 30 miles or something like that. So then they started heading west. So in 1871, they built across Minnesota into North Dakota, and they also started on the west end at Colima, Washington, which is on the Columbia River, building towards Seattle. So they were working on both ends. And so in 1872, they reached Fargo. And in 1873, they reached the Missouri River. So now they were cooking along pretty good. And they also built these big shops. You might have seen them sometime in Duluth, in Brainerd. Big shops, yeah. And they're still there. You can see this is a modern.
Yes, they are.
I go by them every time. Event center and all sorts of things, but they huge buildings, so they kept them, which is nice. So on the west end, here's Colima, Washington, right here, and so they were building this line from Colima up to Tacoma and then Seattle, and this became the only line. The Great Northern got trackage rights on it, and eventually Union Pacific got trackage rights on it. So today it is BNSF, and that's also where they run the coaster or whatever they call that thing that runs between
Sounder,
Seattle,
Sounder, yeah,
and Portland. So anyway, in 1874 they defaulted on bond interest because their financing was always a little bit dodgy, and so here's Wall Street. So they started having financial problems. And they continue to have financial problems. And so then partially because the NP failed, other railroads failed, they had a financial crash. And so for 7 years, not much happened. But then in 1862, they got going again, and they laid 164 miles across North Dakota, and they finished 45 miles in Washington, all the way up to Tacoma. And so Henry Villard was head of the NP, but he also started the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company. And so he started building this railroad east along the south bank of the Columbia River. And he just continued right on up because the Columbia he didn't have to cross the Columbia here. The Columbia River kind of flows like this, and then it kind of heads north. So he just built all along the south bank, all the way up to Portland. And so that became the route that the NP came in, and then they just went down the Oregon Railroad Navigation Company to Portland, and then they went up to Seattle, like that.
But that line's now UP, right?
Yes. The Union Pacific later got a hold of this, and this became the Union Pacific line. Here it splits off, and it goes down through the Blue Mountains to Salt Lake City. Yes, you are absolutely correct. Yeah.
And the BNSF's on the north side of the river.
Yes, they built the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle on the north side. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And so then the NP said, we don't want to. We want to have our own railroad into Seattle and Tacoma. And this is a long convoluted way to go. You have to go all the way down here like this and back up to Seattle. So they started building this thing, and they did pretty well. Of course, then they had again in the Cascades, like they ran into on the Great Northern. So they went over Stampede Pass, and initially they had these horrible switchbacks like they have down in Peru, and then they built a tunnel, and then they expanded the tunnel, and the Stampede Tunnel is still there. And it was closed when the BN merged, but later they opened it up again, because for heavy trains, it's much better. And as we talked about with the Great Northern, the way they built the Cascade Tunnel on a grade, they can only run one train per hour, and then they put fans to clear the thing out. So they needed the Stampede Tunnel too. And so in 1883, $1 million bridge was built across the Missouri River between Bismarck and Mandan. And one of our crew is in charge of replacing that bridge right now. It's going to be a huge project, and it's tricky because, of course, there's issues with the river and everything. And this thing comes across the river and then it makes a sharp jog to the south. And so there's land issues, and it's hard to find places for construction and stuff like that. But anyway, he's working on that. The BNSF has to replace that bridge. So by 1883, trains were running between Livingston and St. Paul. And so Henry Villard pushed hard to lay more track. And then in 1884, all of a sudden Wall Street realized that the Northern Pacific had this long line, and these branch lines hadn't been built, this long line with very little traffic, as opposed to the Great Northern. They compared it to the Great Northern, which was profitable and had all these lines up here. And so the NP had this long line, and so the Wall Street investors drove the stock price down. And so Henry Villard had to leave the NP, and then they went through a series of management changes. Meanwhile, the NP was looking for a logo. And so one of the NP managers was at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. And he saw the Korean flag with the yin and the yang. And he said, that's really cool. Let's use that as our logo. And so they did. And so the logo, this is the logo. Initially, it just said Northern Pacific and then the Yellowstone Park line. And then later they changed it to Northern Pacific Railway. And that lasted from 1893 until the merger in 1970. And so that was quite a classic.
They never got sued like you do nowadays.
Yeah. No, I suppose maybe the Koreans thought it was pretty cool. I don't know. Yeah.
They may not have known.
Yeah, they may not have known. Who knows?
Communications are different than what they are today.
That's right. We're talking, 1893. And so in 1970, the Burlington Northern was finally merged, because Jim Hill had tried to do it back in the late 1800s by merging the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and CNS and SP&S. Now, as we talked about last time, the GN and the NP owned each owned about half of the Burlington, the CNS, and the SP&S. So it was just basically merging the GN and the NP and then wrapping everything in. So one of the big things they had to give, the reason they were able to do it, ironically, was because of the Milwaukee Road. And of course, the UP was out there too. But the Milwaukee Road was parallel. So they said, well, there's competition. But ironically, the BN merger put the Milwaukee Road out of business. They got all sorts of concessions, and Milwaukee was able to go into Portland, and they all of a sudden had all this traffic. But because they had built the Pacific Line and they never really recovered financially, they went for years. They had not maintained the track, and so after the merger, they had all sorts of traffic, but they just couldn't haul it, and they had a lot of derailments. It was really sad. So that's the history of the NP. Now we'll look at a little bit at the, we'll start up here at some of their just kind of typical steam locomotives and some of their characteristics.